All right, welcome to the second video of Module 17, where we're finishing up our discussion on the body systems. We just finished in Module 1 talking about the endocrine system, and in this video, we're going to discuss both the skeletal system and the muscular system. So this video is going to be a little bit longer than most of our other videos, but just pause the video, stop it whenever you need to, take a break, etc. All right, so first, skeletal system. All right, the skeletal system is made up of multiple types of connective tissues. The body has three types of connective tissues. You have bone, ligaments, and cartilage. The bone are basically hard elements of the skeleton. The ligaments are dense fibrous connective tissues, and ligaments specifically attach bone to bone. We'll learn about tendons in a little bit, where those attach muscle to bone. And then finally, cartilage, which is a specialized connective tissue that uses collagen and elastic. It's all kind of made together in this gel-like ground substance, which is also called a matrix, and it helps to reduce friction in joints, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So things like synovial joints, ball and socket joints, and then it also helps to cushion the vertebrae. So whenever you walk or jump, it helps to cushion impacts between those vertebrae. And I said that there are three types of connective tissue in the body, so I misspoke here. I should say that the three types we're going to focus on are these three types. Blood is also a specialized type of connective tissue, for example, and so I just want to make sure that's not, there's no confusion there. So these are three types of connective tissue we're going to talk about with the skeletal system. Now, the skeletal system has a bunch of important functions that it has to serve. And so the skeletal system itself is very hard and rigid. It's made out of non-living extracellular crystals and other calcium minerals. And it's basically living tissue that's made up of um, different types of cells that will help with reforming bones or remodeling bones as they grow and develop throughout our bodies. But overall, it's serving five big functions. The first is to support our bodies. The second is to provide protection for our organs. So like our internal organs in our thoracic cavity or abdominal cavity, our brain in our cranial cavity, and so that protection is there from the skeletal system. Also, movement. It So the skeletal system combined with our muscles really supports our body and allows for us to have that fine motorized movement. It's also important for blood cell formation. So the bone marrow actually makes all of the different blood cells that are within our circulatory system. And it's really important for mineral storage. And so our bones will store things like calcium and phosphate. And so if there's too much calcium in our blood, that calcium will be absorbed by our bones and stored. And then if we need calcium, then our bones will release that calcium back into our bloodstream. So big five important functions that our skeletal system is responsible for. And now we're going to go over the major bones within the body. So an adult individual has approximately 200 or approximately has 206 bones in the body. You have your cranium or your skull, which is made up of several different bones. You have your maxilla, your mandible. You have your clavicle, your scapula, your sternum, your ribs, your humerus, your ulna, your radius, your carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. You have your coccygeal bone, your sacrum. You have your femur, patella, and your tibia. Then the smaller one is your fibula. And you have your tarsals, your metatarsals, and your phalanges. And so there's a few other bones that we haven't mentioned. So there are, again, your cranial bones. There's bones kind of in the upper portion of the mouth the roof of the mouth, I guess you could say. And then there's many vertebra. We have 12 pairs of ribs, and then you have generally 2 of each bones in your appendicular skeleton. And so what we're going to focus on is bones in different categories. So we're going to start with the axial skeleton, which is bones on the center line, basically. So that's your cranium, your maxilla, your mandible, your sternum, your ribs, your spinal column, so your vertebra. And so, yeah, that's your axial skeleton. Then your appendicular skeleton is all of the other bones. So all of the bones in the appendages and what attaches those appendages to the axial region. And so we kind of have that summarized for you here. So your axial skeleton is the midline of the body. So that's where your skull, your sternum, your ribs, your vertebral column are found. I got sternum up here twice. Then you have your appendicular skeleton, which again are the bones of the appendages, and then whatever bones attach those appendages to their associated structure. And so that's like your pelvic girdle, your arm bones, your pectoral girdle, and also your legs. Okay. Now, first looking at the axial skeleton, we're going to kind of focus on the bones here in this region of the skeletal system. So we mentioned the skull is made up of cranial bones and facial bones. One bone that we did not mention in the previous couple slides is the hyoid bone. And this bone is interesting because it doesn't articulate with any other bone. It's mainly attached to the trachea and the body, or that area of the body with ligaments and connective tissue. And so the hyoid bone is basically the attachment point for muscles of the tongue, the larynx, and the pharynx structures. The vertebral column, and then the ribs and the sternum. And we'll look at these in a little more detail in the next couple of slides. But first, starting out with the cranial bones, there are a couple of different bones that make up the cranial or the cranium. And so the whole function of the skull is to protect the brain. And it's made up of a frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, your temporal bones, your sphenoid bone, your ethmoid bone, nasal bone, lacrimal bones, and then your occipital bone. And we have an image that we're going to show the location of all of those bones. Now your facial bones are the maxilla, the palatine bones, the vomer, the zygomatic bones, and then your sinuses, which is basically air spaces within the cranial and facial bones. Now this image here shows the location of all of those bones. So you have your parietal bone here, which is basically the top of the head. The occipital bone is the back region of the head. Your frontal bone is basically your forehead. Then you have your temporal bones on each side. So there's one on the left and one on the right. And then in front of that, you have your sphenoid bone. Again, there's one on each side, and it kind of wraps around underneath the skull. You have your zygomatic bones, so that's your cheek bones. And then kind of inside the eye socket, you have your lacrimal bone, okay? Your nasal bone. And then all of this bone here is one structure, and that's the maxilla. And then your lower jaw is the mandible, okay? And so if we take the skull and we flip it upside down, you can see your 2 sphenoids, your 2 temporal, your occipital, the bottom portion of the parietal, your zygomatic, the maxilla, and right behind the maxilla on the roof of the mouth is the palatine bone. And then inside of that, there's a little cavity that goes down, and that bone, little bone in the middle there, is your vomer bone. Okay. And so those are all of the bones that make up the skull, the cranial, and the facial bones. Okay. And so you'll want to be able to identify those if you were given a diagram, say, on your final exam. Now this image here is your hyoid bone, and you can see the hyoid bone here and how it attaches to the larynx, the trachea, and then the pharynx will be in the back of the mouth here. And again, it's the attachment structure for the tongue within the mouth. Okay. So other areas of the axial skeleton is the vertebral column. Now, the vertebral column is responsible for protecting the spinal cord as it runs from the brain to the lower portion of our abdominal cavity towards the posterior area, and allows all the nerves and neurons to kind of go from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. There are 5 different regions in the vertebral column. Starting from the skull and going down, the first 7 vertebrae make up the cervical region. The next 12 make up the thoracic region. And these 12 vertebrae are the ones that have the ribs growing off of them. The lumbar is the next 5 vertebrae after the thoracic. The sacral vertebra are actually 5 fused vertebrae, and then the coccygeal is the next 4 fused vertebrae. Okay. And then between each of these vertebrae are intervertebral discs, which are cartilaginous discs that cushion impacts of the vertebrae to keep them from, hitting one another and grinding against one another during our movement. And that's what allows our bodies to kind of move and be flexible. Now, you can get a disc to what's called slip, or basically bulge out of that intervertebral space, and it can push against the spinal cord or other nerves, and it can cause real severe back pain in individuals. Now, here's a figure of the vertebral column. So you have the first 7 again as a cervical, then the thoracic, and so these are the ribs or the vertebra that your ribs are attached to. Then you have your lumbar, your sacrum, which is 5 fused vertebra, and then the coccyx, which is the last 4 fused vertebra. Okay, so your 5 different regions of the vertebral column. Now, this figure shows a healthy disc between 2 vertebrae and an image of those healthy discs. And this shows a herniated disc. So a disc that's basically been damaged and bulged out, and it's actually pressing against the nerve. And you can see that disc pushing against that nerve there. That's running basically this white space here. And so that's probably causing a lot of pain in that individual. All right, so the next portion of the axial skeleton is going to be the sternum and the ribs. And so like I mentioned, the ribs come off of the thoracic vertebra, and their purpose is to protect the lungs and the heart. We have 12 pairs of ribs, so 1 pair for each of those 12 thoracic vertebrae. 10 of the ribs are attached to the vertebra and the sternum. Okay. The lowest 2 pairs are attached only to the vertebra, but not the sternum, and they're known as our floating ribs. Okay. And the sternum is basically the breastbone that's in the front of your chest, and it serves to be a hard structure to protect your heart. So here's an image of our rib cage, right? So you can see thoracic vertebra 1, that first pair coming off, and then thoracic vertebra 12. And what you notice is pair 11 and 12 do not attach to the sternum, right? Pairs 1 through 10 will attach to the sternum. 1 through 5 is interesting because they directly attach to the sternum. 6 through 10, they attach a little indirectly. So they kind of all run to the same type of cartilaginous tissue, that then connects to the sternum. Basically, what you need to know is 1 through 10 are your ribs that connect, and then 11 and 12 are your floating ribs. Okay. Now, after your axial skeleton, we're going to focus on the appendicular skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton has an upper area that's made up of the pectoral girdle and your upper limbs. So the pectoral girdle is your shoulders, which is made up of your clavicle bone, which is your collarbone, and then the scapulas, which are your shoulder blades. And then your arm consists of the humerus, which is your upper arm bone, your forearm, which is the radius and the ulna. Your wrist has 8 carpal bones. Your hand or your palm has 5 metacarpal bones. And then your fingers and thumbs are made up of the phalanges, which are 14 individual bones. We have an image here that kind of shows those relationships. So you have your pectoral girdle, the clavicle, and the scapula. You have the humerus. You have the radius and the ulna. And the way I remember this is that the radius is on the side of the thumb. Kind of how I remember. And so your radius and then your ulna. Then you have your carpals, your metacarpals, and then your phalanges. Okay. And the legs are going to be structured pretty much the same way. They're going to have their girdle. In this case, it's the pelvic girdle, so your hip. It has 2 coxal bones, a sacrum and a pubic symphysis. And we'll show what this pubic symphysis is. It's kind of the connected area in the front of your coxal bones. It's a cartilaginous area. And then your legs. So you have your upper leg, which is a femur, your kneecap, which is the patella, your lower leg, which is the tibia, and the fibula. Then you have your ankle, your foot, and your toes, which have corresponding bones of the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. Now here's the image showing those. So again, you have your oh man, I'm blanking. Pelvic girdle. Yes, there we go. Pelvic girdle. With your coxal bones, your sacrum, and then your pubic symphysis. So that's that cartilaginous connection between the coxal bones. Then you have your femur, and then you have your tibia and your fibula. Okay. So I just remember the small one is the fibula, or you could remember the big one is the tibia. That'll help you remember. I also remember that the fibula makes up the ankle bone, right? So the lower end of the fibula is kind of the bone that sticks out at your ankle. And then below that, you have your tarsals, your metatarsals, and then your phalanges. Okay. And so that's the bones of the body. And so, like I said, we have 206 bones in an adult, and they make up the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Next, we're going to look at the types of joints that exist between bones. So the joints are classified based on how much movement they allow. So fibrous joints are immovable. And an example of a fibrous joint are the joints between the flat bones of a skull. And you're probably actually familiar with this because you know how babies have what we call the soft spot on the front of their head. That's actually the fibrous joint that has not solidified into bone yet. And so that soft spot is the area of connective tissue between those skull bones that hasn't ossified yet and is still growing. The cartilaginous joints are slightly movable. They have a cartilage connection, and these are the joints, for example, like between your vertebra. The third type of connection is a synovial joint. This is freely movable, and it's bones that are separated by a fluid-filled cavity. So this would be like your elbows and your knees, for example. So here we have an image of the fibrous joints. So the red kind of connective area here are the fibrous joints. And you can see where that soft spot would be in an infant's head. And so these bones will continue to grow and connect together and ossify and develop into the hard cranial structures of an adult. Now, the synovial joints, like we mentioned, are the joints that have a fluid within that joint. And the fluid is secreted from a synovial membrane. And so there's a membrane that's in this joint that helps to lubricate the joint so that there's no friction in between the bones that are moving. So like when your elbow moves or your knee, you don't want your forearm and your lower upper arm bones grinding together as you move your arm. And so that synovial membrane helps to lubricate the region to make sure that there's no friction. And then you also have haline cartilage in that area to help as well. And that haline cartilage is acting as a cushion between those bones that are connecting together. There are two types of synovial joints within our body. You can have a hinge joint, which again is our knees and our elbows. And then you have a ball and socket joint, which is our shoulders and our hips. Okay. And in these jointed areas, you also have connective tissue known as tendons that are joining bone to muscle. And we have an image of that here. Right, so we have a synovial joint. All right, so we have a synovial joint here. This is our knee. Right, so you have your femur, you have your haline cartilage, right, is helping with that cushion. You have a bunch of ligaments in here, so that's bone to bone connection. You have your patella, you have your tibia, and then your fibula. Right, again, notice all of the ligaments. But then you also have muscle that is on top of these bones. And so, for example, your thigh muscle. Your thigh muscle is connected to the patella via a tendon, okay? And then your patella to the bone, for example, via ligaments. And what you also notice is there's a meniscus in here. So this is also a cartilaginous cushion to help with, forces between the femur and the tibia. And so the synovial joint here is going to have synovial fluid that is being released to help lubricate this joint as this portion of the bone kind of grinds or moves across, right, that meniscus there. That helps reduce that friction. Okay. Now, to finish up with the skeletal system, we're just going to mention ligaments and tendons kind of in written form for you. So again, ligaments attach bone to bone, for example, in a synovial joint. And an example of a ligament is an ACL. And then your tendons attach muscle to bone. So for example, your Achilles tendon. Now, both of these structures, ligaments and tendons, are composed of connective tissue. So tissue that's containing collagen that makes it strong, but also flexible. So it can support the connection of bones to bones or muscles to bones, for example. And the muscles that the tendons are attaching to are also helping to stabilize those joints. And you'll have, like, for example, antagonistic muscles that work together to help with arm movement. So for example, when you flex your arm, your bicep contracts and your tricep relaxes to allow that movement to happen and stabilize that joint during that movement. Okay. All right. So that's it for our kind of intro to the skeletal system. What we're going to go into now is an intro into the muscle system. Okay, so muscle tissue you find in every organ, and the muscles are participating in pretty much any activity that is requiring movement, right? And the muscles are what's causing that movement to happen. Now, on average, A considerable proportion of our body weight is in the form of muscle. So, for example, males have generally about 40% of their body weight being as muscle. Females, on average, is about 32% for muscle. Now, everybody has three types of muscle. You have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay. Skeletal muscle is muscle that you voluntarily move. So you have conscious movement over that muscle. And it attaches to our skeletal structures and helps to provide us with strength and mobility and movement. Now, your cardiac muscles are found only in the heart, which is why they're called cardiac muscles. So cardiac is associated with the heart. Your smooth muscles are found in the walls of our organs and our blood vessels, right? And those smooth muscles are involuntary movement. So basically, movement that we don't have any control over. So voluntary is a conscious control over movement. So moving your arm, moving your legs, walking, running, picking up a pen, etc. And that's your skeletal muscles. Involuntary movement is that unconscious movement that you don't have control of. Contractions in your stomach, um, contractions in, say, your bladder causing the urine to be released, or your heart beating. So all of those are involuntary movements, and the involuntary muscles are both the cardiac and the smooth muscles. Now, there are also muscles in our body that help that have a job to resist movement. So, for example, there are muscles in your lower back that are there to kind of help your body maintain posture, to maintain upright. There are muscles that are specifically for, say, maintaining blood pressure. And then also muscles are used to generate heat. So, for example, when your muscles shiver, when your body shivers, your muscles are contracting and relaxing very quickly. And that's causing the muscles to use energy. So, this metabolic energy. And that metabolic process is not 100% efficient. And so it loses energy as heat. And so if your muscles, you know, contract and relax really quickly, they're generating a lot of heat relatively quickly. And that serves as to help warm up our bodies, say when we're cold. Now, the activity of muscles, so that fundamental kind of movement of muscles, is in the form of contractions. And we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit. But basically, muscles are excitable. So that means that they will contract in response to an electrical or a chemical stimuli or stimulus. And so all muscles will have one mechanism of action. They will contract and then they will relax. When they contract, the muscles shorten. When they relax, the muscles lengthen. And again, we'll talk about how that process happens specifically within a couple slides from now. All right, so here is a figure going over kind of the major muscles within the body. You want to be familiar with the muscles on this figure. So you have your masseter, which are the muscles of the jaw, your orbicularis, which is around the mouth. So like you're closing your lips. You have your pectoralis major, which is your chest muscles. You have your serratus anterior, which is right under your chest muscles, kind of in your armpit area. You have your biceps. You have your rectus abdominis, which is your abdominal. I'm sorry, is your abdominal muscles. And then your external oblique is adjacent to those abdominal muscles. You have your adductor longus, which is in your thigh area right here. Then you have your sartorius, which is this muscle that curves around that adductor muscle. You have your quadriceps group, which are kind of right above your knee. And then you have your tibulus anterior, which is on this side here. That's your right side. And then on the back, you have your deltoid, which is right above, right on top of your shoulder, basically. The trapezius is kind of that upper inner back muscle. On the back of your arm, you have your triceps. Then this lower back muscle here is your latissimus dorsi. So these are like your posture helping muscles. Um, the glutamus maximus, which is your butt muscles, that helps with rotating your thigh and extending your thigh. Then in the back of your leg, you have your hamstrings, you have your calves, which is your gastrocnemius muscles, and then your Achilles tendon. Okay, and so you want to make sure you're familiar with these muscle groups. Okay. Now, looking at individual muscles and basically what they're made of. Muscles are interesting in that they're nested groups of cells, and muscles basically have what's called the same origin, insertion, and function. So an origin is where a muscle is attaching, and an insertion is where a muscle is kind of going over a joint. And so your muscles will have those same origin and insertion points and also have the same function. So I'm just going to go to this figure real quick. So like this is your origin point for your bicep. This is your insertion point. So they have the same origin and insertion point. And the function here is to help with arm movement, right? So when your bicep contracts, it shortens, causing the forearm to move upwards, and your tricep is relaxing, right? And if your bicep relaxed, your tricep would contract, pulling the arm down and allowing it to fall forward, your forearm, okay? So a muscle is just that group of muscle cells with that common origin and insertion. Now, the muscle cells of a muscle are found in bundles of muscle fibers, okay? And these are called fascicles. And this bundle of muscle fibers is just a bunch of cells, muscle cells, wrapped in connective tissue. And this connective tissue is what's called a fascia, okay? Now, these muscle fibers that are found in the fascicles are your muscle cells. Your muscle fibers are very long, they're tube shaped, and they can be a few millimeters in length to upwards to 30 centimeters in length, depending on the length of the muscle. So for example, your bicep is longer than a few millimeters. So the muscle cells in your bicep will be longer to compensate for that muscle size. Muscle cells also have many nuclei, so they're multinucleate. And they are packed with what's called myofibrils. And these myofibrils are structures that have proteins that interact with one another that lead to muscle contraction and relaxation. And these proteins are called actin and myosin, okay? And so we're going to use the figures in the next couple slides to basically break down all of these different components, okay? So here we have our whole muscle, right? This one muscle has that same origin and insertion point and the same function. Now, if we look at this muscle, which is the bicep, it is made up into several different fascicles. So each of these groups here are individual fascicles, right? So there's a fascicle, there's a fascicle, there's a fascicle, so on and so forth. And so we've got one fascicle pulled out, right? So this is that muscle bundle, which is also a fascicle. Now, the connective tissue that surrounds these bundles and kind of keeps them in their own bundle is called a fascia, okay? So that pink connective tissue there is a fascia. So that's those lines in between those bundles are all fascia, okay? Keeping those bundles separated, all right? Now, if we look inside these bundles, See all of those little tiny circles there? Let me get a different color here. So that circle, right? That circle, all of those little circles are individual muscle cells. They're a single muscle fiber. So let's say we pull one of those muscle fibers out, right? That's what you're looking at here. That's a single muscle fiber, okay? Now, within this muscle fiber, we can zoom into it, and that's what we're going to do. So that's what we're doing on this next slide. So this is one muscle fiber. So this upper image is this image zoomed into, okay? So that one muscle fiber has multiple nuclei. You can see one there, and one there. And then that muscle cell has many different myofibrils. So each of these little circles here, these little cylinders, right, is a myofibril, okay? That myofibril will contain the two protein, actin and myosin, okay? So here is a micrograph of skeletal muscle cells. So each little area here is its own muscle cell. And then in these muscle cells, right, would be the little myofibrils. Okay. And you can see the different nuclei. The black dots are the nuclei. Okay. Now, within these myofibrils, you have the myosin and the actin. Okay. The myosin and the actin make up part of the contractile unit, which is in the myofibril. And this unit is called a sarcomere. Okay. So if we look at this myofibril, see these striations here? So this area right here is one sarcomere. That's a unit. So there's a sarcomere unit right there. Here's another one. Right, there's another one. And another one. So each one of those are sarcomeres. And each sarcomere is the contractile unit within the muscle. So in order for a muscle to contract, this unit will shorten, and this one will shorten, and then this one will shorten, and this one shortens. They all shorten at the same time. And so if you have all of these shortening at the same time, overall your muscle will shorten a lot when it contracts, right? So that's how you get big movement out of a lot of little movements, basically. And so those striations here, right there, right, those striations are called Z-lines. And the Z-line is the attachment point for that contractile unit, which is the sarcomere. Okay. And so again, a sarcomere is a segment of the myofibril that's extending from one Z-line to the next. Okay. And so the arrangement of those Z-lines and those sarcomeres is what causes skeletal muscles to have this striated pattern like we're seeing in this bottom figure. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in to one sarcomere, one unit. Okay. That's what we're going to do. We're going to zoom in, and that's what we've done here. We're looking at one sarcomere. So you see the Z lines here, right here, that Z line. You have it on both sides. And so from this Z line to this Z line is a sarcomere. So that's one contractile unit. And now within this unit, you can see some little lines. So here's a line, and then there's a thicker line in the middle. Those thick and thin lines are your actin and myosin filaments. So those actin and myosin proteins. The thick filament is the myosin filaments. The thin filament are the actin filaments. notice how the myosin filament has all of these little round kind of like um, bundles that are on that protein. Those are going to be important in a little bit because that's how the muscle contracts. So basically what happens is these myosin heads will grab onto this actin and push inward. And it causes that thin filament to move closer towards the center. And it will do the same thing on this side, and it will push, causes it to move closer to the center. So when it's relaxed, the gap between these actin filaments is this big. When they contract, the gap will close, right? And so it will shorten the space in between that gap, okay? And so you do that for every sarcomere unit, you get a bunch of little contractions, ends up with a big contraction. And so if we look at a cross section, that's what this image here is. You can see the big myosin proteins that are surrounded by those thin actin proteins, okay? And so for a muscle contraction, each sarcomere is just shortening a little bit. And when you add all of those up, it leads to a big movement in the muscles. And so the basic way a muscle contracts is that you'll have a skeletal muscle to be activated by a nerve. So it'll get an electrical stimulus, basically telling the muscle to contract. That nerve activation will cause an increase in the concentration of calcium ions near the myosin and actin proteins. The presence of the calcium basically allows that contraction to happen. And then when the nerve stimulation stops, the calcium gets reabsorbed, and then the contraction stops, and then the muscle relaxes. And so that's the basic process of the contraction. Now, just kind of going into a little more detail, we have motor neurons that are going to come in contact with the muscle cells, and those are going to stimulate those contractions. You get a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine that's released from the motor neuron to what's known as the neuromuscular junction. Okay, so that's just the gap between the motor neuron and the muscle cell. That acetylcholine helps to transmit the electrical impulse from the neuron to the muscle cell, and then that electrical impulse travels down what's called T-tubules. And as that electrical impulse travels down the T-tubules, it releases calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That calcium then causes the contractions to be able to happen between the myofibrils and the the myosin and the actin, okay? And so just to show a figure of that process, you have the motor neuron releasing the acetylcholine, which transfers that electrical signal to the muscle cell. That electrical signal then goes down the T-tubules, which are here, and then it tells the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is all this blue net-like stuff, to release calcium. And then that calcium is released and it interacts with the actin and the myosin proteins to allow the contraction to happen. So now we're going to zoom in on the actin and myosin proteins and look at specifically how the actin and myosin contract, okay? So we said that the thick filaments are the myosin proteins. The thin filaments are the actin proteins. So the way contraction happens is a formation of what's called cross bridges between the thin and the thick filament. The calcium has to be present for these cross bridges to form. So basically what happens is if there's no calcium, the actin filaments will be covered up by what's called troponin tropomyosin complex. And it will cover the myosin binding sites on the actin molecules. But when calcium's present, it opens up those binding sites and slides the troponin tropomyosin complex over and allows the myosin to attach to the actin. Okay. So when that calcium is released, it binds to troponin. The troponin tropomyosin complex shifts positions. That myosin binding site is exposed. Then the myosin head will attach to the actin and form a cross bridge. That actin filament will then be pulled towards the center of the sarcomere, causing the sarcomere unit to shorten. Okay. Now this figure here shows that in action. All right. So we have our sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? This is wrapped around the myosin and actin proteins. It releases the calcium. That calcium will bind to the troponin complex, which is on the actin, right? It would be on the actin, covering up those binding sites. The calcium will come in and bind, and it will shift this out of the way. And as it moves out of the way, then those myosin heads can attach to the actin and push that actin towards the center, creating a smaller gap, causing the sarcomere unit to shorten. Okay. Once the nerve activation ends and the stimulus goes away, the calcium is reabsorbed back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This requires energy in the form of ATP. The calcium is no longer bound to the troponin tropomyosin complex, and so the myosin binding sites are now covered. But then ATP has to bind to the myosin heads so that they can be released from the actin. So if you don't have calcium present, you don't get cross bridges, and you don't. So that doesn't allow for muscle contraction to happen. So the muscle is in a relaxed state. So here is showing that calcium binding to the troponin tropomyosin complex causes it to slide out of the way of those binding sites so that the myosin heads can attach to it and cause the contraction movement. Okay. And so we all know that we need energy to move, to walk, to run. Well, that energy is really required because muscles require energy to contract and relax. So ATP is needed for contraction, it's needed for relaxation, and you can replenish the ATP molecules through a variety of ways, through stored carbohydrates such as glycogen, through glucose, fatty acids, and other high energy molecules that are stored in our body, and then also through creatine phosphate. Right? And so remember that ATP is used to allow the myosin heads to release, and also to allow the calcium to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Right? Okay, so that's it for the second video in this module. I know that was kind of a longer video. So that covers skeletal system, muscular system. We've talked about the endocrine system. So the last video for this module will cover the nervous system. And then once we finish with the nervous system, we'll be done with the body systems chapter, or chapter 16 in the open source book. Okay. And so that's it. We'll see you in the next video.